everyone, and welcome to our first lecture video. In these videos, I'll usually present some helpful historical, biographical, or critical information to help us think about the text of the week. This week we are starting with Jane Austen's Emma, so I want to share some biographical information about Jane Austen, some historical information about the Regency period, and some background information about class in Regency England. Jane Austen was the daughter of a rector, and she grew up in a family that valued education. Her father would train young men who were preparing to go to Oxford for their education, and their presence in the house, as well as her older brother's education, certainly shaped her own. Jane and her older sister Cassandra, though, would also go to school twice. Once they boarded with a woman who served as their tutor, less great situation, but then a better situation. For about a year and a half, they were students at Abbey House School in Reading, where they received a well-rounded education, which at that time for a girl meant British European history, French language, things like needlework, dancing. Marilynne Robinson writes that many of Austen's sister's classmates would write of, and this is quoting Robinson's biography, leisurely afternoons allowing visits to the nearby lending library, which catered adeptly for the tastes and imaginations of girls and young women by the way of romance, adventure, and much male greed and villainy. So, if these books read at school contributed to Austen's literary development, the world of stories and theater at home also did similarly. Her family and the boys who lived with them would write and produce plays, and she also had a cousin, Eliza, who was an important part of Austen's literary and social development. Eliza had traveled to Europe and owned a house in London. She had done amateur acting herself. She was familiar with the trends in theater in London. She even helped produce a play when she visited her Austen cousins, and she would host the Austen siblings in London. All of this really helped introduce them more broadly to society and to contemporary literature by way of theater. Jane Austen wrote a lot of juvenilia that's still popular with devoted fans today, but she's best known for publishing 6 major novels: Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Persuasion, and Northanger Abbey. Austen is remarkable for a few different reasons, and I want to cover a few of those here. While several other women published novels throughout the late 18th and early 19th century, many of these novels were in the Gothic and Romantic traditions, some of them great novels, some of which were by the most famous female British novelist to date at the time, Anne Radcliffe, who wrote 6 Gothic novels across 17 volumes over the period of 3 decades. She wrote quite a bit. Austen, on the other hand, though, had her first novel accepted for publication in 1810, and her last 2 major novels were published in 1818, the year after her death. That is 6 major novels, all of which endure as very popular literature in the 21st century, published within a decade. That's pretty remarkable, I think, for even by modern standards, but perhaps even more noteworthy is the way in which Austen wrote outside of the traditions of Gothic literature and sensational romance, and instead focused on the everyday issues facing women among her class. She thought about relationships with siblings, education, inheritance, female employment, and most importantly, Austen herself never married. Wrote stories in which marriage was not only a matter of romance, and also not only a matter of finance. So blending kind of the romantic world of literature with the realistic world that she lived in. She asked questions about the role of female agency, the financial pressures women faced, and even allowed a space in which marriage was not always the best choice for female characters. Understanding class and money in Regency England, I think, is essential to understanding Jane Austen. I often teach Pride and Prejudice in Gen Ed Lit, and one of the things that I quickly realized when I started teaching that novel is that students somewhat understandably so, would take the novel's discussion of money and assume that, well, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, the romantic interests were in the rich, most upper class spheres of society. The Bennet family was lower class and poor. The Bennets in this novel are always worrying about money, admiring how much money other people have, worrying about not having money once the father dies. So readers unfamiliar with the Regency period would very understandably not understand that all of the characters in this novel were, in fact, members of the same class. So to go into what that class looks like, at the beginning of the 19th century, class systems in England looked different than they do today. The middle class, as we know it, hadn't really come into being. So when you read references to middle class when people are writing about Jane Austen, or really most of the 19th century, what they're really doing is trying to equate the reality of Austen's world, the reality of the early 19th century, with something somewhat analogous to ours. But what actually existed in England was a system around roughly 6 different class levels. So at the top was the aristocracy, the king or regent, the princes, the princesses, the dukes, the duchesses, all that. At the next level, though, then was the gentry. The gentry was the land-owning class, by some estimations, around 5% of the English population. The men in this class constituted most of the voters in England. If you owned a large piece of land, you also got to choose the rector for the church on your land. So while being a clergyman was not necessarily a very lucrative position, it did put you in the position of being in what they would consider good society. Most of Austen's writing focuses on this class because she herself, the daughter of a rector, this was the class among which she herself would be associated. After the gentry comes merchants and professional class, and we see some of those in Emma as well. Men who make their money trading imperial goods, lawyers, doctors, and at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, then factory owners. Next comes the working class and those in servants, and then at the bottom of the class hierarchy of the time were those in poverty who depended on local welfare. Many of Austen's heroines are women born into the gentry class, like Emma, who face financial and social crisis because of the laws around inheritance. Emma is the exception to this pattern. The laws around land ownership were designed in theory to keep large properties of land from being divided up continuously over generations until there was no land left to divide anymore. So primogeniture dictated that in most cases, land was passed from father to the oldest son or to the oldest living male relative. Younger sons would often choose other careers and become military officers, clergymen, or go into trade. Daughters would need to marry, or they could live off the generosity of brothers like Jane Austen did, or they could live off of money that their father had set aside for them. They could also become governesses, who were live-in teachers that helped boys before they went off to school and helped train girls until they came of age. But this obviously required that they themselves had a strong foundation in education. Well, all of Austen's novels give us a peek into a, sliver of Regency society. I like Emma because of the extent to which it is a novel about a neighborhood, about a town. So you aren't merely aware of the presence of different classes of people, but you see Emma interacting, or sometimes pointedly choosing not to interact with a lot of different kind of people in Highbury and the surrounding areas. Emma's a fantastic novel, I think, for bringing to life early 19th century British rural town life, and I'm really excited to discuss it with you.